What if your memories of another life weren't imagination, but echoes of a real past? From ancient warriors reborn as modern soldiers to children describing lives they never lived, history holds eerie patterns too precise to ignore. Coincidences, they say, but when stories align across centuries and strangers share identical scars, it begs a chilling question. Are we living more than once? Stay until the last chapter, where we reveal the most shocking reincarnation link ever uncovered, one you'll never forget. Chapter 1: The Boy Who Knew Too Much. In a quiet Oklahoma suburb, a young boy named James began to say strange things. He was barely past his 4th birthday when he started talking about planes. Not toy planes, real ones, fighter jets. Warbirds from a time long before his parents were born. He'd grab his crayons and draw cockpit panels in meticulous detail. Buttons, levers, and dials that no preschooler should understand. Then he'd name the aircraft: Corsair, Hellcat, Mustang. His mother thought he had an active imagination, until he started crying in his sleep, begging to get out of the burning plane. Over and over, the same dream: a dogfight in the sky, a Japanese Zero on his tail, flames, smoke, the ocean rising up, then silence. Every night, the terror returned, and each morning, James remembered more names, ranks, squadrons, even aircraft carriers. It wasn't just play. It felt like a memory unraveling itself, as if a curtain were being slowly pulled back on a past he never lived. His parents tried to explain it away. Maybe he saw something on TV, but they monitored everything. No war movies, no video games, no books on battles or planes. Yet James spoke of Iwo Jima and Midway like someone who had stood on the deck. He mentioned a man named Jack Larson, said he was his best friend, claimed they both flew missions from a ship called the Natoma Bay. One day, his father, half curious and half afraid, looked it up, and there it was: USS Natoma Bay, an aircraft carrier active in the Pacific during World War II. Jack Larson, also real, still alive, still listed on veteran rolls. That's when the fear set in. James wasn't just making this up. He was remembering things he had no way of knowing. Every new detail matched historical records, down to the number of bullets in the gun bays. And one day, he finally said his own name: James Houston Jr. James Houston Jr. had been a real Navy pilot, shot down in 1945 over the Pacific. His body was never recovered. The military had listed him as killed in action. Now, 60 years later, a child who shared his first name was claiming to be him. The boy described how his plane was hit in the engine, how it spun and crashed near Chichijima. He even knew the type of plane Houston had flown, a FM-2 Wildcat. His father, now unable to ignore the pieces falling into place, contacted Jack Larson himself. When he spoke to the veteran, Larson was stunned. James, the child, knew things only Houston could have known. Their missions, their training, even inside jokes. The resemblance in behavior was uncanny. James had never met Larson, never been told these things, but somehow they were there, burned into his mind like scars left over from another lifetime. Then came the drawings, page after page of war scenes, planes in formation, ships under attack. One picture showed a plane trailing smoke, with a red circle on its tail, the unmistakable insignia of the Japanese Zero. Another showed a pilot ejecting just as the wing burst into flame. James labeled each image, not just with names but technical terms: flaps, stabilizers, altimeters, terms he had never been taught. At one point, he scrawled a map with tiny islands and marked an X. When researchers compared it to World War II battle maps, the X aligned almost perfectly with where Houston's plane had gone down. Too precise for guesswork, too detailed for coincidence. His parents were now certain they weren't just witnessing imagination. They were watching another lifetime bleeding into this one. One day, James even asked why his plane didn't explode sooner, why it had taken so long to crash. His father had no answer. Eventually, psychiatrists and researchers from the University of Virginia's Division of Perceptual Studies got involved. They had documented over 2,000 cases of children recalling past lives. But James's case stood out. It wasn't just verbal memories. It was technical precision, verifiable history, and emotional trauma. He had nightmares, PTSD-like symptoms, and an intense obsession with airplanes from a very narrow window of history. Under gentle, non-leading questioning, James continued to give names and dates that checked out. Every layer revealed another eerie connection. His personality matched that of Houston, brave, impulsive, and stubborn. He even had a phobia of Japanese flags. When shown a white flag with a red circle, James refused to touch it, and when asked why, he simply replied that it was the enemy's flag. It was like a switch inside him flipped. He wasn't playing, he was remembering. As James grew older, the memories began to fade. The nightmares slowed, and the intensity of his recollections weakened. By the time he was 10, he no longer cried out in the night. The drawings stopped, but the scars on his psyche remained. His parents, once skeptical, had come to believe in reincarnation because they had lived beside it, raised it, and watched it try to find peace. James Houston Jr. may have died in 1945, but somehow, someway, a piece of him came back. Through this boy, through his pain, through his memories. In a world that clings tightly to logic, the story of James from Oklahoma opens a crack in the door, a glimpse at something science can't fully explain. The mind of a child should be a blank page. But what if some are already written on, inked with names, battles, and final breaths from lives that once were? Chapter 2: Pharaoh's Return in a British Body. Dorothy Eady was an ordinary girl living in early 20th century London, until she fell down the stairs at the age of 3. Doctors declared her dead, but minutes later, she woke up, different, quieter, staring off into corners, drawing strange symbols in the margins of her books. Her parents chalked it up to trauma, but the dreams began soon after. Endless visions of columns, sand, and music that pulsed like a heartbeat. As she grew older, Dorothy began to insist she was not from England. She wept when taken to the British Museum's Egyptian exhibit, hugging the statues as if reuniting with family. She claimed her real name was Bentrashit, that she had once lived in the temple of Seti I, that she had died for breaking sacred vows. Her voice trembled with emotion no child should carry. No one believed her, but nothing could stop the growing sense that she had returned to a world that was no longer hers. Her memories deepened with age. In her teens, she began studying hieroglyphs obsessively, soon surpassing her teachers. What baffled scholars was not her fluency, it was her accuracy. She read symbols no textbooks had published yet. She filled in linguistic gaps that Egyptologists hadn't solved. And then came the impossible. She began writing letters in ancient Egyptian, in grammatical forms that experts would only later confirm as correct. Her understanding wasn't academic. It was intimate, as if she wasn't learning but remembering. A prominent archaeologist, intrigued by her insight, invited her to Egypt. And when she arrived at the temple ruins of Abydos, she froze. Her hands shook. She began walking directly to places that had not yet been excavated, pointing to rooms and gardens long lost to the sands. Everything she predicted was later found exactly where she claimed. She moved to Egypt permanently. Locals began calling her Seti, Mother of Seti. She lived in a modest home near the ruins, worked closely with Egyptologists, and claimed regular dreams in which the spirit of Seti I visited her. Though dismissed by some as eccentric, even skeptical archaeologists couldn't deny her uncanny ability to locate lost chambers, hidden inscriptions, and even underground tunnels buried for millennia. Once, during a dig near the temple, she insisted that a specific stone column once bore a carved scene that had been destroyed. Her description matched the damage that had only been discovered through careful restoration years later. No records existed of the original image, yet she described it as though she had once stood beneath it herself. But perhaps the most chilling moment came during a private test. A renowned Egyptologist asked her to identify items in a dark chamber, objects that had not been catalogued, things only a priestess from Seti's time could have known. Without hesitation, she passed every test. She named obscure tools, described their ceremonial uses, and even corrected one mislabeled artifact. The professor never spoke publicly about that night, but in his private notes, later found after his death, he wrote that either she was a reincarnated soul or the greatest unsolved mystery in Egyptology. Seti didn't seek fame. She lived simply, gave tours, and spent hours alone in the temple. Locals said she often spoke to someone they couldn't see. She would disappear into the ruins at night, leaving behind only footprints in the dust and candles flickering in the dark. When she died in 1981, Seti requested a simple burial, no grand ceremony. But whispers followed her into the grave. Scholars still debate her knowledge. Psychologists label her case as extreme cryptomnesia, the mind retrieving forgotten details from random sources. But that explanation never satisfied those who met her. Her life was not just about memories. It was about connection. Her love for Egypt was fierce and unexplainable, like a tether across lifetimes. If she was delusional, then why did her delusions restore ancient temples? Why did her hallucinations align with undiscovered facts? And why did so many who doubted her leave Abydos with more questions than answers? Dorothy Eady may have been born in England, but her soul, it seemed, never left the Nile. Some dismiss her story as an elaborate fantasy, but the trail she left through hieroglyphs, ruins, and records refuses to vanish. She wasn't just another believer. She was living proof of something deeper, older, stranger. Seti never asked to be believed. She simply remembered, and what she remembered could not be explained by logic alone. Hers is not the only story where ancient lives bleed into modern ones, but it stands as one of the most compelling. Because here, in a modern British body, walked a woman who felt the weight of rituals thousands of years old, who knelt in temples that called her home, and who may have carried, Within her, the soul of a priestess long lost to time. The sands of Egypt never forget, and maybe, just maybe, neither do we. Chapter 3: The Burning Monk and the Modern Activist. It began with the fire. Every night, in the dreams of a young Thai man named Vikhai, flames would roar upward, swallowing his body as he sat still, unmoving. He felt the searing pain, the choking smoke, but even more than the agony, he felt purpose, a strange, calm determination. He would wake drenched in sweat, heart pounding, unable to speak. First, he thought it was a nightmare, but as the visions returned, the details became clearer. The robe on his skin, the crowd watching in silence, the sound of old engines in the distance, and the heat, always the heat. He became obsessed with the image of a monk in fire. He drew it compulsively hundreds of times. In every drawing, the man sat in meditation, his robe swallowed by flames, his face eerily peaceful. But Vikhai didn't know this monk's name. He only knew that he was somehow remembering something he had lived before. As he grew older, Vikhai became increasingly political. He joined activist groups, marched against injustice, and gave passionate speeches about human rights. He spoke with a strange intensity, like someone who wasn't just angry about the present, but haunted by the past. His friends admired his energy, but worried about his obsession with sacrifice. He often spoke of burning as a kind of freedom, of silence as protest. One day, while researching historical acts of protest, he stumbled upon a grainy black and white photo. The image shook him to his core. There, in the center, was a Buddhist monk engulfed in flames, sitting motionless in the middle of a Saigon street. His heart stopped. The image matched his dreams perfectly. Same pose, same robes, same expression. It wasn't just a resemblance. It was a memory. Vikhai didn't recognize the photo. He remembered being there. The monk's name was Thich Quang Duc. In 1963, during a wave of religious persecution in South Vietnam, he had set himself ablaze in protest. His self-immolation shocked the world. Journalists captured the moment, but no one ever explained how he remained so calm. Vikhai was born more than 2 decades after that fire. He had never studied that chapter of history. He had never heard the name. But now the puzzle pieces twisted into place. The smells, the street, the sensation of peace in the final moments. He began to write down everything he remembered. Small details that had no reason to be true, how the fuel smelled, where the traffic had stopped, how the crowd had reacted. He described the exact intersection, even details that had been erased by modern construction. Researchers were startled. His descriptions matched uncannily with historical accounts, down to the color of buildings that no longer existed. Curious psychologists subjected Vikhai to past life regression, a process he agreed to reluctantly. In his trance, he described life in a monastery, long hours of chanting, secret meetings between monks, the fear that came before the fire, and then the decision. He spoke of meditating in a small chamber the night before, preparing his soul to leave without resistance. He cried during the session, whispering apologies to his fellow monks. When shown videos of the real Thich Quang Duc, Vikhai reacted with overwhelming emotion. He described the monk's thoughts in those final minutes. Not pain, not anger, but serenity. He said the fire wasn't meant to destroy, but to awaken. These weren't theories, they were declarations, spoken not with wonder, but with certainty. It felt less like storytelling and more like a man returning to a truth long buried beneath flesh and time. The story might have ended there. An eerie case of identification, maybe a coincidence. But then came the moment that chilled even skeptics. Vic Hai traveled to Vietnam, seeking the site of the self-immolation. Standing at the intersection where the old photo had been taken, he broke down in tears. Without being told, he pointed to the exact spot where the monk had sat. The stone beneath his feet had changed, the buildings around it replaced, but he said he felt the heat rise again. He sat down, legs folded in the same lotus position, hands resting on his knees, and for a moment it felt as if time itself blurred. Locals watched in silence. Some wept. A few whispered the name of the monk aloud, as if calling him back. And Vic Hai remained still, his face calm. Peace, no words, just memory. Vic Hai eventually returned to Thailand, but something in him had changed. He gave up his activist career. Instead, he joined a monastery, where he spent his days in silence and study. He never spoke publicly about his visions again, but in quiet circles, among those who knew him best, the story lingered. They said he carried the soul of a martyr, that his past had burned so brightly, it found its way through the ashes of time. In the flames of one protest, a soul had been released. And somehow, decades later, that soul had returned, reborn into another body, still carrying the message. If true, it meant the fire had never gone out. It had simply waited, and in a world full of rage and forgetfulness, one man had remembered what it meant to burn for peace. Chapter 4: The Case of Identical Scars. In a quiet farming village in northern India, a boy named Tanuj was born with something no one expected: too large, discolored marks on his chest and the back of his head. The villagers whispered about the scars. One looked like a wound from a blade. The other resembled the kind of injury no newborn should ever have. His parents dismissed the rumors. But as soon as Tanuj learned to speak, he began saying strange things. He told his mother he had been shot, that he died suddenly. He even claimed to know who did it. As the seasons passed, he said more. Names, places, what he was wearing when he died. His words were hauntingly specific, and when elders pressed for details, the boy didn't falter. He didn't make up stories. He gave them a name. The name of a man who had been murdered 5 years before Tanuj's birth, in the same village. Shot once in the chest, then in the back of the head. The villagers were stunned. The man, Ravi, had been well known. He had argued with his cousin over land. Then one morning he was found dead in the fields. No witnesses, no arrest, no justice. And now, a child barely old enough to count was telling the story as if he had lived it. Tanuj described the clothes Ravi wore that morning. He named the brand of sandals, even the food he had eaten before leaving home. His parents, frightened, begged him to stop, but he wouldn't. He said he needed to see his old house, to walk his old land. When they finally gave in and took him there, Tanuj walked the property without hesitation. He pointed to where he used to sleep, to the tree where he had tied his goat, to the water jar he said he had hidden behind a stone. When villagers checked, they found it, covered in dust, untouched for years. But the most chilling moment came when Tanuj was taken to the cousin accused in the murder. The boy's face changed, his smile vanished, and with a stare too old for his young face, he called the man by name and said he remembered. The cousin laughed nervously, then grew silent. He tried to claim it was all coincidence, but villagers started talking. Some recalled that Ravi's body had indeed been shot in the exact places where Tanuj bore his birthmarks. The wounds had never been shown publicly, and yet here they were written on a new body. A local doctor, skeptical at first, documented the locations and dimensions of the marks. He later compared them to Ravi's autopsy report. The match was disturbing, too exact, like a map of death printed onto skin. The cousin quietly sold his land and left the village. He never returned. No charges were ever filed, but the fear remained. Researchers from the University of Delhi came to study the case. They brought photographs, maps, and reports from Ravi's murder. Tanuj identified them all. He recognized faces he had never seen. He corrected the researchers when they mislabeled a photo. He even described the smell of blood and dust in the air that morning. When asked how he knew so much, Tanuj simply said he remembered. The researchers interviewed villagers, relatives, and police. The consistency of Tanuj's details, paired with his matching scars, was undeniable. They wrote a paper on the case, calling it one of the most compelling examples of birthmarks connected to violent death in reincarnation studies. But what science couldn't explain was the child's emotional burden. Tanuj often woke crying. He had trouble playing with other kids. He said he missed being taller, missed drinking tea, missed the quiet of the fields before he was killed. It wasn't fantasy, felt like grief. As Tanuj grew older, his memories began to fade, like smoke dissolving in air. The dreams stopped, the stories quieted. By the time he turned 10, he no longer remembered Ravi's life with the same intensity. But the marks on his chest and head remained, silent reminders of something deeper. His parents never spoke of the past again. They told him it was all behind him. But sometimes, at night, Tanuj would sit by the fields and stare at the horizon, as if waiting for something to return. Maybe a feeling, maybe a memory, or maybe just the echo of a life that ended too soon. The villagers still talk about him in hushed tones, about the boy with the ghost scars. And many believe that Ravi's soul came back not for vengeance, but to be heard, to tell a story that the living had tried to forget. In the end, the case of Tanuj isn't just about birthmarks. It's about memory, about the way trauma finds its way through generations, about the possibility that some wounds don't fade with time, but instead find new skin. The mystery isn't only how he knew, it's why. Why would a soul return to the place of its death? Why would it carry the exact same scars? In a world ruled by logic, such stories shouldn't exist. But in this quiet village, beneath the sun and soil, something did. Something walked back into life with wounds already written. Not metaphorical wounds, real ones. And whether we accept it or not, Tanuj's story forces us to ask the question that hangs over every case in this journey. What if some deaths are not the end? What if they are only a door, one that opens again? Chapter 5. Civil War Soldier Reborn. It was supposed to be a simple weekend trip. Jack Turner, a middle-aged man from Tennessee, had always been drawn to Civil War history. He read the books, watched the documentaries, even collected artifacts. But nothing prepared him for what happened when he stepped onto the battlefield of Gettysburg. As he walked the worn paths beneath gray skies, something shifted. The ground felt heavy. The air tasted like smoke. Then, without warning, Jack collapsed. Not from exhaustion, but from something deeper. Paramedics found him conscious but shaken, muttering phrases that made no sense to anyone around him. He spoke of troop movements, shouted unfamiliar names, and begged someone to fix his bayonet. It wasn't a seizure. It was something else. Later, at the hospital, he told the doctors he'd seen a war. Not a vision. Something real. Something he swore he had lived. It was the beginning of a journey into a past that refused to stay buried. Back home, Jack couldn't sleep. The images returned night after night. Cannons, mud, the smell of blood-soaked uniforms. He felt drawn to places he had never visited before, instinctively tracing old battle maps and naming regiments he had no way of knowing. His wife, worried for his sanity, suggested therapy. One specialist recommended regression hypnosis. Reluctantly, Jack agreed. The session that followed was anything but expected. Under hypnosis, his voice changed. He described himself as Elijah Harland, a Confederate soldier stationed in Northern Virginia. He gave a unit number, names of fellow soldiers, even described how he died, struck in the chest during a retreat. His final thoughts were of home, not victory. The therapist, stunned, recorded every word. Later, researchers cross-referenced his testimony. The details aligned with a lesser-known Confederate unit that had been decimated near Gettysburg. One soldier's name stood out, Elijah Harland, buried in an unmarked grave, until now forgotten. Driven by obsession or destiny, Jack returned to Gettysburg. He wandered off the path, following what he called instinct. Beneath the trees, he stopped and knelt beside a moss-covered stone with no inscription. He began to cry. He didn't know why, but something inside him said this was it. Local historians confirmed that many soldiers had been buried hastily during the chaos of battle. The spot Jack found corresponded with where Elijah's regiment had fallen. A few feet away, using ground-penetrating tools, a team discovered bone fragments and rusted Confederate buttons. No DNA match could be confirmed, but the location, artifacts, and Jack's knowledge, so eerily accurate, were enough to raise questions. Jack didn't claim to be Elijah, but he felt like he had carried Elijah's fear, his loyalty, his final breath. And now, standing in the place where that life had ended, Jack whispered a promise to never let it be forgotten again. He began speaking at local history groups, not as a reincarnation believer, but as a man with memories that couldn't be explained. He described the feeling of being bayonet not as a metaphor, but as a physical sensation etched in muscle. He had dreams of friends whose names no one remembered, and perhaps most haunting, he showed knowledge of Southern war songs that had never been recorded, only passed down orally. One night, during a talk at a Civil War museum, Jack sketched a camp layout without pause. The historians were shocked. It matched a layout from a Confederate diary, never made public, that had only been uncovered months prior. How could he have known? When asked, Jack simply said it came to him, like remembering a childhood home. Not imagination, memory. As his story spread, skeptics dismissed it. But those who met him in person often left with a chill they couldn't shake. Jack's life changed. He no longer collected Civil War artifacts. He donated most of them to museums, saying they didn't feel like collectibles anymore. They felt sacred. He began writing down Elijah's story, not as fiction, but as a memoir from another life. In his book, he described the fear of freezing nights, the screams of wounded comrades, and the moment he saw the enemy's bayonet just before everything went dark. He didn't glorify war. He mourned it, and readers could feel the grief in every page. Veterans especially connected with his words. They said he wrote like someone who had truly been there. Jack never asked anyone to believe him, but he asked them to remember that maybe, just maybe, the dead return not to haunt but to heal, not to fight again, but to be heard. Years later, a memorial plaque was added near the tree where Jack had knelt. It bore two names, Elijah Harland and Jack Turner. Below it read a simple inscription, 2 lives, 1 memory. Whether Jack truly was Elijah Reborn is something science can't explain. But what matters more is that a forgotten soldier now has a voice. That through Jack, a man who fell in the mud of war now lives on in words, in hearts, in questions we may never fully answer. And perhaps that's the point, that the soul is not bound by time, that memory may outlast flesh, and that in the quiet stillness of a battlefield, the dead sometimes speak, not through ghostly whispers, but through the breath of those who walk again where they once fell. Chapter 6. The Pianist from Nowhere. In a modest apartment in Krakow, Poland, a 7-year-old girl named Eliza sat before an old upright piano. She had never taken a lesson, never read a sheet of music. Yet when her small fingers touched the keys, what came out was not the halting sound of a beginner. It was Mozart. Smooth, complex, emotionally rich. Her parents stared in silence as she played entire passages from memory, with phrasing and tempo that seemed too advanced even for seasoned musicians. Neighbors came to listen. A music teacher was brought in, and his expression said it all. This wasn't talent. It was something else. Eliza didn't just play. She inhabited the music. She adjusted fingerings instinctively. She closed her eyes and swayed like someone remembering, not learning. She said the melodies came from dreams, that she just needed to listen. But when asked who taught her, she gave a name no one recognized. A name that would open doors into a mystery lost in time. Her parents, desperate for answers, began researching the name, Henriette Vogel. They assumed it was fantasy, but then, in an obscure corner of a European music archive, they found it. Henriette Vogel, a 19th-century child prodigy from Vienna, known briefly in elite musical circles. She had performed for nobility at just 8 years old, then vanished without a trace before her 12th birthday. No records of her death, no family tree, no photos, just a few surviving compositions and reviews praising her as gifted beyond her years. The most chilling part came when Eliza was shown one of Vogel's handwritten scores. She read it fluently, identifying the notes, style, and corrections. She even pointed to a section and whispered it had been a mistake. When compared to a second draft by Vogel, she was right. Eliza had caught an error no musicologist had ever noticed, and she had never seen the manuscript before. A research team from Warsaw University was brought in to evaluate her. They gave her new scores to play, pieces written centuries ago and never performed publicly. Eliza played them without pause. They even created fabricated sheet music with intentional errors to test her. She corrected them again and again with the confidence of someone who had once written them herself. When asked to compose, she produced works in 18th and 19th century styles, not inspired by those periods, identical to them. Her phrasing mirrored composers of the Romantic era. Her hand movements were untrained but precise, like muscle memory without explanation. A neurologist scanned her brain during play and found something unusual: activation patterns more typical of adult concert pianists, not children. Still, the most unsettling evidence wasn't scientific. It was emotional. Eliza cried after playing certain pieces. She said they made her sad, not because of the music, but because they reminded her of something she had lost. As she continued to develop, researchers traced the layout of her abilities alongside Vogel's known work. One of Eliza's original compositions mirrored the harmonic structure of Vogel's unpublished lullaby. Locked in a Berlin archive Eliza had never been told about. The structure, timing, even the melodic key progression were eerily similar. Coincidence, genius, or something more? The question deepened when a descendant of the Vogel family was contacted. He brought a faded portrait of Henriette, one of the few known images. Eliza studied it quietly, then touched the piano. She said she remembered the dress, the way it pinched her sleeves. She spoke of a blue ribbon lost during a recital, something never mentioned in any public account, but documented in a private letter found in a Viennese collection later that year. With each layer of truth uncovered, the line between past and present blurred. Was Eliza a musical echo, or was she Henriette, returned? By the time Eliza turned 12, the age Henriette disappeared, she began to change. Her interest in classical music faded slowly. She played less, composed less, the dream stopped. Her teachers noticed a shift. Still brilliant, but less obsessed. As if something inside her had said goodbye. Her parents didn't push. They let her grow into her own self. Yet those who witnessed her early years still talk about the nights she filled the room with music older than memory. Her case is still studied today by psychologists, neurologists, and historians alike. Some say she was a rare savant. Others believe her brain was wired to absorb and mimic. But none can explain how she accessed music never taught, errors never published, and emotions never experienced in this life. None can explain why a girl who never touched a piano could one day sit down and bring the 19th century back to life. Eliza's story may not prove reincarnation, but it challenges what we believe about talent, memory, and the soul. How do we explain a child channeling the music of a forgotten prodigy? A girl who dreamed of sonatas that hadn't been heard in over 100 years? If this was merely coincidence, then it was a chain of them, each more improbable than the last. But if it was something more, if Henriette Vogel found her way back through the hands of a Polish girl, then music may be more than notes and rhythm. It may be memory made sound, a soul whispering through keys, a life once silenced, playing again. Chapter 7. And Frank, again. In the quiet suburbs of Stockholm, a 7-year-old girl named Lena began speaking of things she should not know. Her parents assumed she was just imaginative, but her stories were detailed, too detailed. She spoke of hiding in cramped spaces, of the smell of musty walls, of the fear of being found. She spoke of diary pages she never wrote and voices whispering in the dark. The strange part was not just the content, but how deeply emotional she became while recounting them. She cried without knowing why. She spoke of a war she had never studied. Lena had no connection to the Holocaust, no reason to understand the terror of being hunted. But what emerged in her drawings? Narrow staircases, wooden beams, people crowded together in silence, sent a chill through anyone who saw them. Her teachers noticed. One recognized a familiar layout and contacted a historian. And what came next blurred the line between memory and something far more mysterious. Lena's drawings matched the hidden annex in Amsterdam. Not loosely, precisely, the furniture, the kitchen, the stairwell. Even the bookshelf that once concealed the entrance. She had never visited the Netherlands. Yet she described the scent of old paper and the creaking of the floorboards with unnerving accuracy. When asked how she knew, Lena simply said she remembered it from before. She often awoke at night screaming, gripped by nightmares of boots on wooden steps. Her parents sought therapy, believing it to be trauma. But the sessions only brought more fragments, memories of a sister named Margot, of writing while seated at a narrow desk, of fearing the sound of sirens. None of this made sense for a modern child with no connection to World War II. Her therapist began researching past life phenomena and stumbled across the case of Anne Frank. Then the parallels began aligning with terrifying precision. Lena had never read the diary of Anne Frank. Her parents were certain. Yet when passages were read aloud to her in session, she responded as if recognizing her own thoughts. She finished sentences. She corrected pronunciations of names in Dutch. She even criticized small inaccuracies in dramatizations of the diary, things only a first-hand observer might notice. The therapist, a skeptic at first, began documenting every session. Lena recalled birthdays, meals, even a particular cat that had been mentioned only once in surviving documents. The details kept surfacing, and then came the moment no one could explain. She recited the full layout of the annex from memory, not just the rooms, but the secret compartments, the pantry door, the chipped tile near the back wall. Every detail matched. Too many to be guesswork, too vivid to be coincidence. Her case eventually reached a professor of transpersonal psychology who had studied reincarnation across cultures. He arranged a trip to Amsterdam for the family. At first, they hesitated, but curiosity and fear won out. Upon arriving at the Anne Frank house, Lena froze. Her hands trembled. She wept silently. Then, without prompting, she walked past the crowd, up the stairs, through the exhibit, and stopped before the bookshelf. She touched it gently, like recognizing an old friend. She walked into the annex, pausing in doorways, whispering under her breath. In one room, she stood still and said this was where she wrote. When they brought her to Anne's small bedroom, she refused to enter. She only said she remembered what happened next. Her mother held her tightly as the girl cried, not like a tourist moved by history, but like someone mourning a home they never thought they'd see again. The experience haunted everyone involved. A camera crew documenting the visit captured her reactions, later shown to psychological associations across Europe. While some dismissed it as a powerful case of empathy or subconscious absorption of historical narratives, others were not so sure. Lena's responses went beyond learned behavior. She anticipated changes in the exhibit that had been made only recently. She spoke of paintings that used to hang, photos that had once been there, now removed, all verified, all real. But perhaps the most shocking moment came when she found an old music box displayed behind glass. She whispered that it used to sit on a dresser, but someone had moved it. Museum staff confirmed that very fact. It had been relocated during renovations, but that detail had never been made public. At that point, the question was no longer what she knew, but how she possibly could. As Lena grew older, the memories faded. She stopped talking about the attic. The nightmares ceased. She said the images had become distant, like echoes underwater. She grew into a normal teenager, focused on school and friends. But those who knew her story would never forget. The lines she drew, the names she remembered, the layout of rooms she'd never seen. There are skeptics, of course, rational explanations involving childhood imagination, subconscious pattern recognition, or media influence. But none of those theories can account for the dozens of verified details she never should have known. If Lena was not and Frank reborn, then what was she? If trauma can echo across generations, can memory? Can a soul carry its wounds forward through time, leaving faint trails for others to find? For Lena, the answer came not from books or teachers, but from the deep, unshakable feeling that she had once lived in hiding, and had finally come home. Chapter 8: The Warrior Twins of Burma. In the green hills of northern Myanmar, two twin boys were born just minutes apart under a sky cracking with monsoon thunder. Their parents thought little of the storm, but from the beginning, the boys were different. Before they could even speak full sentences, they acted out war games with an eerie sense of precision. They barked orders in a strange dialect, one that no one in their village recognized. As they grew older, the play became darker. They screamed in their sleep. They described ambushes, jungle firefights, and names that belonged to no family they knew. Their parents dismissed it as vivid imagination, until one day, one twin traced the outline of a bullet wound across his chest and said it was where he died. The other pointed to his neck and said he couldn't breathe when it happened. First, it seemed like a game, but soon they began naming real places, real battalions, real events from a war they never lived through. They spoke of a firefight that had happened over a decade before their birth, a rebel ambush on a military convoy. They remembered the names of the other fighters, including their own, So Min and Kong Zaw. Their parents had never heard these names, but the boys recounted every detail with certainty. They described the terrain where the firefight occurred, a hilltop clearing near the Salween River. When their uncle, a retired soldier, heard their story, he turned pale. He had fought in that very battle. He remembered So Min and Kong Zaw. They had died side by side, riddled with bullets, trying to hold the line. The names had never been mentioned in the household, never written down in public record. Yet these boys, born 10 years later, seemed to carry the weight of their memories as if the wounds were still fresh. The twins' behavior grew stranger. They avoided mirrors, claiming they didn't recognize the faces looking back. They refused to wear certain colors, ones tied to the military that had once hunted them. They knew the sound of gunfire, even though they'd never heard it. They flinched at helicopters. They could disassemble toy rifles like seasoned soldiers. Their drawings showed jungle patrols, booby traps, crude maps marked with routes and escape tunnels. A visiting relative, unfamiliar with their story, glanced at one sketch and asked who taught them military tactics. No one had, but when the boys were brought to the area of the original ambush, they walked the terrain like returning ghosts. They pointed out where they fell, where the enemy had come from, even where one had buried a small knife under a rock. When they dug there, they found a rusted blade. The villagers stopped calling it a game. Local monks were called in to investigate. They interviewed the children separately, testing them with questions about the lives of So Min and Kong Zaw. Every answer matched the testimonies from former rebels. The boys recalled the final moments of their lives, not as if they had read them in a book, but as if they had lived them. One monk noted their vocabulary, terms no longer used among current fighters. Outdated but accurate. They spoke of comrades who had since vanished, whose graves had gone unmarked. The monks eventually made contact with surviving relatives of the original men. A sister of So Min traveled from the south to meet them. When she entered the house, one twin called her by a childhood nickname, one she had not heard in decades. She burst into tears. What could explain this? A trick, a chance coincidence, or something more profound? Two lives picked up exactly where they had left off. The boys were eventually taken to Yangon, where researchers specializing in reincarnation studies recorded hours of interviews. Unlike other cases, this was not one child remembering a distant life, but two, in sync, echoing the same story. When separated, their accounts matched perfectly. They recalled shared strategies, specific injuries, a moment when one had tried to carry the other to safety. The doctors noted not only the consistency of memory, but the intensity of emotion. These weren't lines rehearsed or memorized. They were grief, guilt, brotherhood. As the boys aged, the memories slowly faded, like smoke from an extinguished fire, but the impact remained. They still bore the same scars, still reacted viscerally to the sights and sounds of war. One researcher later wrote that if any case could prove shared reincarnation, this was it. Two souls born together again, bound by a death they never fully escaped. Some in the village believed the boys had been sent back to finish what they started. Others thought their rebirth was a warning, that the cycle of violence might never end unless someone broke it. Whether viewed as spiritual evidence or a psychological anomaly, their case stood apart. Not just because of what they remembered, but because of how perfectly their stories intertwined. If they had lived once, they had died together. And now, perhaps, they had returned with one last chance to make peace with the ghosts that still lingered in the jungle. In Myanmar, where belief in rebirth is woven deep into the fabric of life, the warrior twins were not dismissed. They were respected, watched, and quietly feared, because if souls could return through the fire of war, who else might be waiting for their turn to awaken? Chapter 9. The Surgeon and the Samurai. In the heart of Los Angeles, a Japanese-American surgeon lived a life of science, logic, and sterile precision. Yet behind closed doors, he was haunted. Every night, the same dream returned. One of steel flashing under moonlight, chants echoing through pine forests, and a battlefield soaked in honor and blood. The dream never changed. He saw himself as a man kneeling in armor, a sword clenched in trembling hands, awaiting a duel he knew he would not survive. What unnerved him most wasn't the violence. It was the clarity, the crisp smell of cedar, the weight of the blade, the exact footwork his opponent used. He began sketching these visions during his breaks at the hospital, producing detailed illustrations of 16th century samurai armor, rituals, and sword styles. He had never studied Japanese history beyond high school, but his drawings stunned a visiting historian who recognized their accuracy down to the clan symbols. Something ancient stirred within a man sworn to modern medicine. His parents dismissed the dreams as stress, the product of long hours and suppressed heritage. But the surgeon didn't feel like he was rediscovering culture. He felt like he was reliving it. During a visit to a Kyoto museum, he froze in front of a centuries-old katana on display. Without thinking, he recited a phrase in archaic Japanese, a dialect even the museum curator had difficulty translating. He didn't know where the words had come from, only that they felt like a farewell. That night, the dreams intensified. He now saw the face of his enemy, a rival samurai with a scar across his cheek and betrayal in his eyes. The duel wasn't just a fight. It had been personal. The surgeon, now convinced something deeper was happening, agreed to undergo regression therapy. Under hypnosis, he told a tale that spanned feudal Japan of loyalty broken, a family shamed, and an honorable death in a duel beneath cherry blossoms. The story he told in that trance was unnerving in its detail. He named his clan, described the family crest, and spoke of traditions that had been lost for generations. He knew the proper way to fold a death poem. He described a courtyard layout consistent with a specific warlord's estate long destroyed by fire. His hypnotic recollection ended with a chilling moment, the precise sensation of the blade sliding through his abdomen in the act of seppuku. What caught researchers' attention wasn't just the vividness, but the accuracy. He drew the crest of a now extinct clan that historians believed had vanished without record. When compared to sketches recovered from a private archive in Osaka, his depiction was exact. That discovery turned curiosity into investigation. A scholar traced the name the surgeon gave under hypnosis, Shinzo Takeda. A samurai by that name had indeed lived and died in the late 1500s, recorded only in a footnote buried in an old scroll. His obsession grew. At home, he began collecting artifacts, old swords, scrolls, inkstones, not as trophies, but as relics of something lost and hauntingly familiar. When he held certain objects, he would tremble. The surgeon once touched a tsuba, the handguard of a katana, and broke into tears without understanding why. His surgical precision, his calm demeanor, his natural reflexes with sharp instruments, all began to feel like echoes of another life. Patients noted his unusual grace under pressure, as if battle were nothing new to him. One day, while performing an especially delicate operation, he whispered words that later translated to a traditional pre-duel prayer, caught on the or recording. Colleagues dismissed it as nerves, but he knew. In those moments, his hands weren't just his. They belonged to a warrior long buried beneath ash and time. A warrior who had unfinished business with a life that ended in blood and silence. He returned to Japan once more, this time not as a tourist, but as a pilgrim. Guided by historical clues from his regressions, he traveled to the ruins of a forgotten village near the Hida Mountains. There, he found the foundation stones of a home that matched what he had seen in his dreams. Local monks, intrigued by his knowledge of their oral traditions, showed him a hidden scroll, an account of a samurai betrayed by his own brother, forced to die in ritual rather than war. The name was faded, but part of the kanji for Takeda remained. In that moment, standing in the ruins with wind howling through pine trees, the surgeon wept. Not from fear or confusion, but from release. Something had come full circle. He didn't feel like a man discovering a past. He felt like a man who had finally come home. The spirit of Shinzo Takeda had, in some form, returned. In the years that followed, the surgeon lived two lives. By day, he remained a respected doctor. But at night, he practiced old sword forms alone in his garden, guided by memory rather than instruction. He declined public interviews but quietly assisted researchers studying reincarnation. His case became one of the most compelling in their archives, not because of fame or spectacle, but because of its consistency, depth, and historical accuracy. There was no fame to gain, no motive to fabricate. Just a man haunted by flashes of a life once lived with honor and cut short by betrayal. In a world where science seeks proof and the soul remains elusive, his story stood at the intersection. Not a conclusion, but a question. How could one man, born centuries later and continents away, hold memories buried in burned villages and lost scrolls? If Shinzo Takeda had died with honor, had he now returned to live with purpose? Chapter 10. The Tragedy of the Titanic. Twice, she had never seen the ocean. Born and raised in the heart of Alberta, Canada, she lived among prairies, wheat fields, and snow-covered hills. Yet from the time she could speak, water haunted her. Not lakes, not rivers, but vast, endless water that churned with icy black waves. By the age of 6, her night terrors began. She would wake up gasping for air, clawing at her chest, screaming about sinking, freezing, and hearing people cry in the dark. Her parents assumed it was just an overactive imagination. But as she got older, the dreams sharpened. She began describing the deck of a large ship, the feeling of it tilting beneath her feet, and the sound of something breaking in the distance. She drew pictures of an ocean liner split in two. One day in school, she pointed at a photo in a history book and whispered the name Titanic before her teacher had even read the caption aloud. At first, everyone assumed she had picked it up from TV or books, but her parents insisted they had shielded her from anything about the Titanic. Still, her descriptions kept coming: detailed floor plans of the first-class cabins, the location of the grand staircase, the metallic creak of the ship as it listed to one side. She said she remembered running barefoot across a cold deck, slipping on ice. Most unnerving was her familiarity with the people on board. She spoke of a man named Thomas who tried to calm her. She described a woman in a green velvet dress who screamed when the ship began to sink. When researchers compared her accounts to passenger logs and survivor interviews, names and descriptions began to match. She even recalled lifeboats swinging awkwardly as panicked passengers struggled to board. One night, her parents recorded her mumbling in her sleep, mentioning a boiler room fire. That detail, long debated by historians, had only recently been confirmed. In therapy, she was encouraged to channel her dreams through storytelling. What emerged wasn't fiction. It read like a first-hand account. She described the lower levels of the ship with alarming accuracy, even mentioning a stairwell that few passengers ever saw. When hypnotized, she gave the name Eleanor and said she had been 19 when she died. She described her hands freezing as she gripped the side of the ship, refusing to board a lifeboat without her younger brother. The image of that boy haunted her waking hours, though no one could verify his identity. But researchers found a young woman named Eleanor Wilkinson on the Titanic's second-class manifest. She had perished in the sinking. Even more disturbing, Eleanor had a younger brother named Peter who had survived but was never found again. There were no photos of her, only a few diary excerpts where she had described her fear of traveling by sea and a dream she'd had of dying in the water. The girl's phobia of deep water escalated. At age 10, she refused to take baths unless someone was present. She wouldn't go near pools. Even the sound of running water made her chest tighten. One therapist attempting exposure therapy played ocean sounds during a session. She collapsed in tears. Later, when taken to a maritime museum in Vancouver, she stood silently in front of a scale model of the Titanic. Her hands trembled. She reached out and touched it, then whispered that something wasn't right. She pointed out inaccuracies in the ship's design. Missing railings, lifeboats placed incorrectly. Staff were stunned. They later checked against detailed blueprints and confirmed her corrections were accurate. She had never studied maritime engineering. She had never left the continent. But she knew the ship like it had been a home and a tomb. Something about the curve of the hull, the angle of the smokestacks, made her remember what it felt like to drown. Over time, her memories faded but never disappeared. As a teenager, she began painting. Her canvases always depicted the sea vast, dark, and mournful. Some paintings showed the Titanic breaking apart under a star-filled sky, with figures falling into the waves. When asked why she painted these things, she said she didn't know, only that they came from somewhere deep inside. A visiting professor saw her work and noticed the historical accuracy of the ship's details. He contacted a Titanic researcher who flew in to interview her. During their conversation, she mentioned a crew member who played the violin as the ship went down. She described his face, his coat, even the piece he played. Records showed a violinist named Wallace Hartley had indeed played music during the sinking. She had no way of knowing this. The story chilled the researcher, who later admitted her account included details only recently uncovered from shipwreck expeditions. The deeper they probed, the less it looked like coincidence. Now grown, she lives far from the sea, in a quiet cabin nestled in the Canadian Rockies. She still avoids water, still wakes up with a racing heart when rain beats too heavily on the roof. But she no longer fears the dreams. Instead, she has come to accept them as a part of her, like a scar left by a wound no one else can see. Her story has become one of the most cited modern cases of possible reincarnation, not because of fame or theatrics, but because of its chilling precision. The details, the names, the emotions, none of it fit the life she was born into, yet it all fit the death someone else had lived. A young woman lost in the Atlantic over 100 years ago may have found her way back, not on a lifeboat, but through a soul that refused to sink. In this case, the past didn't stay beneath the surface, came up gasping, cold, and unforgettable. Chapter 11: Rebirth in the Himalayas. High in the icy valleys of Nepal, where prayer flags flutter in the mountain wind and silence is broken only by spinning prayer wheels, the search begins. Not for treasure, not for power, but for a soul. When a revered Buddhist master passes away, it is said he does not vanish. Instead, he returns reborn in a new body, somewhere hidden among the cries of newborns. The process is ancient, precise, and almost supernatural. It begins with dreams. Monks begin seeing signs of visions of rivers, flowers, or distant homes. These aren't random, they are clues. And when the right signs align, a small team is dispatched. Their mission: find the child who holds the soul of the departed Lama. Could take years, or it could take weeks. But when they find the right boy, often a toddler, he will already know their names, already recognize their faces. And sometimes, he points to the master's belongings with eerie familiarity. The most striking case came in the early 1990s. A high-ranking Tibetan Lama passed away at a monastery near the border of China. As tradition dictated, the search for his reincarnation began immediately. Monks entered retreat, meditated, and watched for omens. One night, the senior monk had a vivid dream of a turquoise lake, a wooden house with red windows, and a path of white stones. This vision guided the search. They traveled hundreds of miles through treacherous terrain until they reached a small village nestled at the foot of a glacier. There, in a modest home, a child had just turned 2. He had never met a monk. Yet when they entered the house, he smiled. He called them by names only the previous Lama had used. Then, without hesitation, he walked to the senior monk and touched his forehead gently, an intimate gesture the late master had performed frequently. No one had taught him this. Skeptics often claim these identifications are rituals dressed in superstition. But what followed stunned even the most doubtful. The monks presented the child with a set of objects. Some were toys, others were sacred items, some belonged to the late Lama, others were decoys. Without hesitation, the boy picked the correct items one by one. He cradled an old rosary, stroked a wooden cane, and giggled when handed a bronze cup the late master had used daily. He refused to touch the false items, pushing them away with a look of confusion. This ritual is centuries old, yet its precision continues to defy explanation. From there, the child was taken to the monastery, where his behavior continued to mirror that of the man believed to be his former self. He knew chance never taught to him. He remembered hidden passages in the temple grounds. Monks said it wasn't learning, it was remembering, and the boy never once seemed surprised by his surroundings. As he grew older, the memories did not fade. By age 6, he led chants with perfect intonation. By age 10, he was giving teachings to senior monks. He corrected misquoted scriptures, recalled conversations the previous master had with disciples, and most unsettling of all, he knew the monastery's deepest secrets, ones never written down or spoken aloud to outsiders. This wasn't mimicry. It was knowledge that should have died with the body of a man long gone. Western scientists, curious but cautious, came to observe. They ran interviews, video analysis, and psychological tests. The results were inconclusive. No trauma, no suggestion of coaching, just a child too young to know, yet too precise to doubt. In time, the boy, now a teenager, was formally enthroned as the spiritual successor. His gaze, calm and penetrating, reminded many of the Lama they had once followed. The body was different, but the soul felt the same. This wasn't the only case. Across Tibet, Bhutan, and parts of India, stories like this echo through time. Some children are found within months, others take decades, but the process, rife with symbols, intuition, and trials, produces patterns that are difficult to dismiss. In some cases, the new incarnation remembers the exact location of hidden relics buried by their former selves. In others, they predict deaths, illnesses, or visitors before they occur. While many in the West demand hard proof, the Himalayan communities need none. Their faith isn't blind. It's built on centuries of consistent, lived experience. These are not bedtime stories, but part of everyday life. Entire monastic orders revolve around these cycles of rebirth. The process of death is not an ending here. It's a pause, a breath. Then the wheel turns again, and the soul returns, not randomly, but with purpose, with memory, and with startling clarity. These are not fantasies. They are foundations of a culture that watches souls walk back home. But perhaps the most haunting part of these stories is the eyes. Witnesses often describe the gaze of a reincarnated child as old, too old for their face. Their eyes carry sadness, wisdom, and familiarity. It's as if the soul knows it must start over again, relearn the body, find its rhythm, but deep within, it never forgot who it truly is. And sometimes, just sometimes, they whisper things in the dark. Names of people they once knew, languages they never studied, and on rare nights they sit still and say nothing, just stare at the mountains as if remembering a life lived through different lungs, in robes now too large for their small shoulders. Rebirth in the Himalayas isn't just about proving the past. It's about witnessing a mystery that walks, talks, and breathes among us. A mystery that defies death, and maybe, just maybe, shows us that the soul knows the way back, every single time. Chapter 12. The Artist Who Paints the Past. He worked nights at a shipping yard and lived alone in a small apartment in Florence, Italy. No art school, no training, no brushes in his drawers. Just a man named Luca who, one day, woke up from a dream with paint on his hands. The dream had been vivid faces cloaked in candlelight, robes drenched in burgundy, and gold thread catching the flame. That morning, compelled by something he couldn't name, Luca bought a canvas, oil paints, and brushes. By evening, he had painted a portrait of a woman with piercing green eyes and a style eerily reminiscent of the 16th century Renaissance. It wasn't just the colors or technique, it was the way she stared back, as if she remembered him too. Word spread fast. A local gallery owner saw the painting and asked where he had studied. When Luca said nowhere, the gallery owner stared at him in stunned silence, because this was not amateur work. This was mastery. Within weeks, Luca had created a dozen paintings. Each bore striking resemblance to portraits from a lost generation, rich in chiaroscuro, layered with glazes, and infused with uncanny emotional depth. But none of the subjects existed in history, at least not yet. That's when art historians stepped in. They analyzed brush strokes, pigment mixtures, and composition. The verdict left them speechless. These weren't replicas. They were originals, yet unmistakably aligned with the high Renaissance period. The clothes, hairstyles, even the backgrounds matched forgotten techniques of painters like Titian and Bronzino. But Luca couldn't explain any of it. He said he only saw the images in his dreams. Sometimes the people spoke to him, told him what to paint, what to fix. He would wake up and complete the work, as if he'd merely paused the brush mid-stroke the night before. He didn't think he was talented. He thought he was remembering. Digging deeper, researchers began cross-referencing Luca's faces with obscure museum archives. To their shock, several portraits he painted mirrored lost works that had only recently been rediscovered in private collections. One woman he painted, long thought to be a fictional figure, matched a forgotten study from a Florentine noble family, found in a sealed attic the same year Luca's portrait surfaced. Another face matched a long-lost fresco fragment from a monastery, right down to the scar on her cheek. But the strangest was the portrait of a young apprentice painter, posed before an easel. The details were striking, from the tools to the unfinished canvas. A rare sketch found in Venice a decade earlier had depicted the same face, same stance, same features. But Luca swore he never saw it. He didn't even know it existed. Somehow, he was painting from inside their world, not outside it. It was as though he had been there, brush in hand, centuries ago. Luca's story began attracting attention from psychologists and spiritual researchers. One team hypothesized latent genetic memory, perhaps encoded through ancestry. Another proposed an unusually vivid form of dream-based learning. But none could explain the stylistic precision or intimate emotional nuance of the paintings. They weren't imitations. They were lived-in, familiar, emotionally loaded. Then came the dreams that disturbed him. In them, Luca saw himself in a large stone studio, surrounded by canvases and marble busts. A stern older man lectured him in an archaic dialect of Italian. He dreamt of deadlines, wealthy patrons, and silent apprentices watching from the corners. In one recurring vision, he stood before a great canvas, trembling with both excitement and fear, as if unveiling something dangerous. He began sketching these dreams obsessively, capturing them with the same eerie clarity. When art historians viewed the sketches, they identified the setting as a known Florentine workshop from the 1500s, one that had burned in a mysterious fire. The details were too exact. The layout of the room, the precise placement of tools, even the window view showing a tower no longer standing. Luca's dreams didn't just reflect artistic memory. They revealed a life once lived in full. One historian compared his sketches to an inventory list recovered from the ruined workshop. The match was nearly perfect. Still, Luca had never read art history. He had no interest in it before the dreams began. Now he was painting every night, barely sleeping, as if driven by something larger than himself, as if he were finishing a lifetime's worth of unfinished work. Sometimes, when he stepped back from the easel, tears would roll down his face, not because he was proud, but because the eyes staring back at him felt like his own, reincarnated, not just as a soul, but as a hand, an eye, a memory preserved through oil and canvas. Today, Luca's paintings hang in private collections and museums, often mistaken for newly discovered Renaissance works. He no longer questions where the visions come from. He simply follows them, brush in hand, guided by memory instead of imagination. Some believe he is a reincarnation of a forgotten apprentice who died before his genius could emerge. Others think he is channeling a soul longing for its unfinished legacy to be completed in a new body. But whatever the truth, one thing is undeniable. Through him, the past did not vanish. It returned in color, in line, in shadow and light. Luca's story reminds us that some lives may not be over. Some gifts are only waiting for the right hands to awaken. And sometimes the greatest artist isn't one who learns, but one who remembers. In a world obsessed with originality, perhaps the greatest masterpieces are echoes painted from the depth of another lifetime. Chapter 13. The Forgotten Village Boy. In the hills of northern Lebanon, far from bustling cities and tourist paths, a quiet village clung to its ancient stones and fading memories. It was here that a boy named Kareem, barely 5 years old, began speaking of a life he said he had lived before, just a few miles away. He mentioned names his family didn't recognize, places they'd never taken him, and a death that seemed too precise for a child to invent. He spoke of a white house with blue shutters, a garden with 3 olive trees, and an old woman who made bread in a stone oven. His parents brushed it off as imagination, until one day, as they drove near a neighboring village, Kareem grew pale. He asked them to stop. He knew this place. He pointed toward a winding path, insisting it led to his old home. What followed was a journey that would shake not only his family, but the village they entered. They followed his lead. The road turned to dirt, the air smelled of pine, and the boy's directions never faltered. Past a crumbling wall, down a slope of terraced farmland, they reached it, a white house with blue shutters, just as he had described. Kareem stood silently for a moment before walking to the door like he'd returned from a long trip, not discovering something new. He knocked once. A thin, older woman opened the door. Her eyes widened before she said a word. Kareem looked at her and called her by name. Not the name she gave others now, but the one only her son had used, a son who had died 20 years ago. The woman froze, tears streaming down her face. She whispered her son's name, Youssef, and Kareem nodded. He said he had missed her bread and asked if the olive trees still gave fruit. Her legs buckled. The past had come home. Inside the house, Kareem began identifying objects that were no longer visible. He pointed to a shelf where a wooden box used to sit, described a toy he had played with, and recalled the exact way the back door creaked when opened. Everything he said matched. The woman, a widow named Layla, confirmed each detail, her voice shaking. No one outside her family knew these things. Kareem walked to a corner of the room and said it was where he used to sleep. He asked about a scar he had on his shoulder in the previous life, one from falling off the roof as a teenager. His parents stared at him in stunned silence. He showed them a small birthmark on his left shoulder. Same spot, same shape. As the hours passed, Layla spoke to Kareem not as a stranger, but as someone she had buried years ago. In her heart, it was him. Her Youssef had come back. Villagers heard the story within days. Some were skeptical, others fearful, but many believed. Lebanon is a land where stories and spirits coexist, where old souls are said to linger in valleys and mountains. Local elders interviewed Kareem, testing him with questions only the deceased Youssef would know. He passed them all. He recalled a secret hiding spot behind the chicken coop, the name of a girl he once loved, and a family dispute over land that had never been resolved. He even identified distant cousins by name and corrected them when they misremembered details. The family of the former Youssef, though shaken, began to accept what they couldn't explain. For Layla, it was not proof she needed. It was presence. Her boy had returned in a different body with the same soul. And every time Kareem smiled or spoke of his old life, it was as though time had bent just enough to allow the impossible. Over time, Kareem's memories began to fade. As he grew older, his talk of the past became less frequent. But whenever he visited the village, something in his eyes would change. A glimmer of familiarity, like walking through a half-remembered dream. He once stood at the edge of the olive grove, ran his hand over the bark of a tree, and said it no longer smelled like it used to. He no longer remembered how he died in that previous life, only that it was sudden, that he had missed his mother terribly, and that something had pulled him back to her. His current family documented everything. Journalists visited. A local professor published a report on the case. No clear answers came, but the story of the boy who returned to his mother after 2 decades lingered, passed from home to home like a sacred tale. Not just a miracle, but a reminder that love, perhaps, survives death itself. Science had little to offer in the way of explanation. Neurologists dismissed it as coincidence. Psychologists called it cryptomnesia, forgotten information re-emerging in strange forms. But none could explain how Kareem knew the smell of that house, the creak of the door, or the name of a brother who had died before even Layla's neighbors remembered him. His story joined the ranks of reincarnation accounts that defy logic but demand attention. It wasn't about belief, it was about observation. Here was a child who returned to a place he'd never seen, spoke to a woman he'd never met, and rekindled a love that death had not destroyed. Kareem is now a teenager. He no longer talks about his past life. But sometimes, in the quiet, when no one is watching, he lights a candle and places it near a photo of a boy who died too young. And for a moment, in the flickering flame, 2 lives touch once more. Chapter 14: Firefighter of 2 Lives. In a bustling Brooklyn neighborhood, fire trucks are a familiar sight, and sirens echo through the narrow streets like a city's heartbeat. But for firefighter Daniel Reyes, the sound triggered more than adrenaline. It stirred something deeper. He often woke drenched in sweat, gasping for air, haunted by dreams of black smoke and collapsing beams. In one recurring nightmare, he was trapped in a burning building, unable to escape as the ceiling gave way. He had never experienced such a fire himself, but the terror felt real, too real. And the strangest part? He recognized the building, not from blueprints or city records, but from memory. A warehouse that had burned down decades earlier, blocks from where he grew up. The blaze had killed a firefighter named Thomas Green in 1973. Daniel had never met him, yet the name and the feeling echoed in his bones. Something in the ashes of that tragedy called to him. One day, curiosity overtook him. Daniel began researching the fire from his dreams. The blaze had erupted in the early hours of a frigid winter morning, devouring the old brick warehouse in minutes. The firefighter who perished, Thomas Green, had been pinned beneath a collapsed rafter while helping his crew escape. His body was found near the exit, charred but still clutching a hose. As Daniel read the details, something inside him stirred with painful familiarity. The layout of the building, the way the fire moved, even the decision to enter from the south wall. It was all exactly as he had seen in his sleep. Digging further, Daniel discovered that Thomas Green had lived just 2 blocks from where Daniel had been born, in an apartment that had since been turned into a corner cafe. The coincidences mounted like embers drifting skyward. First, he dismissed it all, but the dreams only grew more vivid. At the firehouse, Daniel's instincts began to draw attention. He could predict how fires would spread with uncanny accuracy, choosing exits and escape paths seconds before the flames took over. Veterans marveled at his gut reactions, calling him lucky. But Daniel knew it wasn't luck. He started recognizing patterns he'd never studied, issuing orders that felt second nature, even though he'd never been in similar situations. Once, during a rooftop rescue, he warned his team to move seconds before the ladder buckled, a flaw that wasn't visible from below. Later, he found out that the same structural collapse had occurred during the 1973 fire, in the exact spot where Thomas Green had died. The repetition of circumstances, combined with the growing volume of dreams, forced Daniel to consider the impossible. What if he wasn't just dreaming? What if he was remembering? And what if those memories weren't his? At least not from this lifetime. Under hypnosis, Daniel described the 1973 fire in chilling detail. He recalled the shift assignments, the number of oxygen tanks, even the type of wood used in the warehouse floor. Records confirmed it all. He described Thomas Green's childhood, his father's job, the name of the dog he had as a boy. None of it had ever been published. Green's surviving relatives, though skeptical, listened to Daniel recount stories no outsider could know. He even knew about a locked box Green had kept hidden in the attic, one that his daughter later found, exactly where Daniel said it would be. In that moment, the line between past and present blurred. Daniel was no longer just a man chasing shadows. He had become the echo of a soul who refused to be forgotten. His fellow firefighters grew quieter around him, watching him with a mix of awe and unease. A man who fought fire with the knowledge of the dead. Over time, Daniel accepted the strange truth that seemed to define his life. He wasn't just a firefighter, he was, in some way, a continuation. The nightmares lessened, but the instincts never faded. He visited Green's grave, knelt beside the headstone, and whispered a thank you he didn't fully understand. A local journalist caught wind of the story and published an article, igniting a brief flurry of interest. Psychologists called it a subconscious absorption of urban legend. Others believed it was a case of inherited trauma, passed through community lore. But those who saw Daniel in action, who heard him speak in a voice not quite his own, didn't dismiss him so easily. Firefighters are trained to trust their gut, and Daniel's gut told him that Green never left the job. He just found a new pair of boots to keep walking in. One soul, two flames, burning through time with purpose. The neighborhood remembers the 1973 fire like a wound that never closed. For them, Daniel became a symbol, proof that sacrifice isn't the end of a story, only a turning point. New recruits were told about him in hushed tones. They said he had the heart of two men, the courage of generations. And sometimes, when a call came in late at night, Daniel would look out the firehouse window and feel a presence beside him. Not a ghost, not a hallucination, just a quiet knowing. The soul of a man who once died doing his duty, now reborn to do it again. In fire, time folds in on itself. In smoke, the past whispers. And in the heartbeat of every siren, there are echoes of lives not lost, but relit. Chapter 15. The Roman in a Modern Suit. Dr. Marcus Ellison never expected his nights to become more vivid than his days. A well-respected historian from Cambridge, Marcus specialized in ancient Roman warfare. His life was neat, structured, and filled with dusty manuscripts, until the dreams began. Night after night, he found himself on ancient battlefields, not as a spectator, but as a soldier. He could smell the iron in the air, feel the sun on his armor, and taste fear before each command. The dreams were not abstract. They were detailed, specific maneuvers, troop positions, and a voice shouting orders in flawless Latin. Marcus hadn't studied spoken Latin to that depth. Yet in these dreams, it rolled off his tongue like breath. He dismissed it at first as the product of obsession, the mind's way of digesting history. But then he began drawing.
Shields, Formation, Fortress Blueprint.
Some matched records not yet published. Some had never been seen. Not until now. His colleagues were intrigued when Marcus submitted sketches for an upcoming article. A few designs mirrored ruins being excavated in northern Gaul, previously unknown to the public. When asked how he knew the configuration, Marcus hesitated. The answer, he had seen it in his sleep, felt ridiculous. But it was the truth. He had mapped a Roman castro from a dream, and archaeologists were now confirming the accuracy. Still, the strangest part hadn't emerged yet. During a late-night dive through old Roman census records, he discovered a centurion named Marcellus Aelius, born in Hispania, stationed near the Rhine. The name sent chills through his spine. In his dreams, that was the name he answered to, a name he had never consciously heard before. The centurion had served under Julius Caesar himself, according to fragmentary records, and the description of his final battle matched Marcus's nightmares, right down to the flaming arrows and broken phalanx line. Haunted by the parallels, Marcus underwent past-life regression therapy at the urging of a curious friend. What surfaced shocked everyone in the room. Under hypnosis, he described ancient Rome with astonishing precision. The layout of the Senate, rituals before battle, conversations in a tongue no longer spoken. The therapist, a skeptic by training, admitted she had never seen anything like it. Marcus named Roman officers lost to history, their ranks and assignments later verified through obscure parchments. He remembered the faces of comrades, the dull clank of bronze sandals on cobblestone. But most disturbingly, he remembered dying. An ambush near the forest edge, a spear through his ribs, and blood mixing with the dirt of a forgotten campaign. He wept without understanding why. The emotion wasn't borrowed from a book or film. It was raw, it was lived. His voice shook as he whispered words from a tongue silenced for 2 millennia. Word of Marcus's experience leaked into academic circles. Some dismissed it as fantasy, the fevered mind of a scholar too deep in his own subject. But others couldn't ignore the evidence. Historians began to question how a modern man, without excavation access, could know the secret tunnel beneath a Roman outpost that had only been uncovered weeks earlier. When shown diagrams he drew years before the dig, archaeologists went silent. The match was too perfect. Even the turns of the passageway, the elevation shifts, and the location of a forgotten weapons cache had been predicted. Some called it coincidence. Others began whispering darker possibilities. Could Marcus be the reincarnation of a Roman officer whose unfinished story refused to fade? If so, what else remained buried within him, waiting to surface? The questions only grew louder, and the answers Marcus knew were far from over. At night, the dreams intensified. Now they weren't just battles. They were personal. Conversations with a wife he had never met, moments of triumph under Caesar's banner, and a child with the same green eyes he saw in the mirror. The dreams blended past and present until Marcus could no longer tell where one ended and the other began. He started walking the streets of Rome differently, sensing familiarity in every worn stone. He visited the ruins of Hispania and stood silent in front of a crumbled villa he had sketched years ago without knowing why. The ruins matched his drawing. He had never been there before, at least not in this life. The boundary between time and memory fractured, and in its place stood a man caught between two worlds, a Roman soldier in a modern suit, walking through a life that was both new and ancient. Eventually, Marcus stopped fighting it. He accepted the dreams, the memories, the instinctive knowledge of things he had no way of learning. He understood now why he had always felt out of step with the world, why lectures about Rome left him with a strange mix of nostalgia and grief. He wasn't merely fascinated by history, he was entangled in it. As he wrote his final book, one that detailed not just Roman tactics but the inner thoughts of its generals and foot soldiers, he left out one detail. He didn't mention that every page had been written from memory, not from textbooks, but from lived experience, etched into a soul that had crossed time and death to finish what it had started. His last sentence closed the book, but not the story. Some echoes are too loud to fade, some lives too restless to remain buried. Chapter 16. The Mirror of War. In two corners of the world, two children were born a year apart. One in Kansas, the other in rural Bavaria. Different languages, cultures, and families. But as they grew, both began to speak of the same thing, war. Not the kind they saw in history books, but missions, flight patterns, and tail numbers from World War II. Each described crashing in the same valley in France. Both remembered the name of the same squadron. Both said they were the pilot of a P-51 Mustang. And both said their name had been Daniel Carmichael. The problem: there was only one real Daniel Carmichael, a pilot who vanished in 1944 during a reconnaissance mission. His body was never recovered, only the wreckage of his plane. That wreck had only one seat, so how could two children, one American and one German, both believe they had lived and died as the same man in the same war? The American boy, Joshua, began drawing planes before he could read. He lined them up with precision and labeled each one in vintage military codes no one had taught him. When his parents took him to an air show, he froze at the sight of the P-51 Mustang. He climbed into the replica cockpit like he had done it 1,000 times. At night, he talked in his sleep, mumbling phrases like Fox 3 and Bingo Fuel. His nightmares were worse. He screamed about flak cannons and called for someone named Riley. His wingman, apparently. His parents were baffled. They had no veterans in the family, no war films in the house. A therapist suggested trauma, but trauma from what? Nothing in Joshua's life explained his fear of burning metal and plummeting from the sky. When researchers heard of his case, they checked military records. A Daniel Carmichael had flown in that exact squadron. His wingman's name, Riley. Across the ocean, a German boy named Lucas began speaking broken English in his sleep before he'd even learned it in school. He also drew planes, identical models, same angles, same nose art. But his memories were sharper. Lucas described the color of the control levers, the engine stall warning tone, and the feel of the oxygen mask when it iced at altitude. His parents were confused. No one in their family had been involved in the war, and certainly not on the American side. When asked where he learned these things, Lucas would say he didn't learn them. He remembered them. One night, he panicked during a thunderstorm, clutching his chest and gasping that he was going down over northern France. The coordinates he shouted matched the location where Daniel Carmichael's wreckage had been found. Lucas had never been to France. He had never heard of Daniel Carmichael. Yet somehow, he knew the details of a pilot's final flight down to the minute. When investigators compared both cases, the similarities were eerie. Both boys had described the same flight mission. Both said the engine failed after taking a hit. Both remembered trying to steer the aircraft away from a village to avoid civilian casualties. And both felt the pain burning, crushing, overwhelming as the plane hit the ground. But here's the mystery. Both boys claimed to have died. They didn't speak of survival. They spoke of the moment the world went dark. How could two separate children remember the same death from inside the same cockpit? It defied every law of physics and every explanation in psychology. Some suggested this was a case of shared trauma passed through collective consciousness. Others whispered something more radical. Could a single soul fracture under extreme fear, scattering itself across more than one body? Was this reincarnation or duplication? As both boys grew, their memories began to fade, but only slightly. Joshua took an interest in flight mechanics, while Lucas became obsessed with navigation maps. At age 10, they both independently built detailed replicas of the same aircraft model, right down to the scratched paint by the left wing. A team of international researchers brought their families together. When Joshua and Lucas met, something strange happened. They didn't speak at first. They just stared. Then Joshua asked if Lucas remembered the hill just beyond the treeline near the crash. Lucas nodded. They finished each other's description of the valley. Neither had ever seen it, yet both recalled the exact shape of the terrain. It was as if each held one half of a complete memory. Two broken mirrors reflecting the same image from different angles. What they shared was not just history. It was identity, a story of war, death, and something unexplainable. Experts still argue about what happened. Some say it's a coincidence amplified by suggestion. Others believe it points to a deeper mystery of the soul, one that modern science can't yet grasp. But one fact remains. Only one Daniel Carmichael ever existed in the military record. One name, one pilot, one plane, and one crash. Yet two boys, worlds apart, relived that same fiery descent. If reincarnation is real, then this case challenges everything we thought we understood about time, identity, and what happens after death. Can a single life echo in multiple bodies? Or does war leave wounds not just on the land, but on reality itself? For Joshua and Lucas, it was never a question of belief. It was memory. Memory neither of them had asked for, but one both of them carried, like ashes scattered by the same wind across two distant skies. Chapter 17. A life interrupted, then continued. When Rose died in childbirth, her family was shattered. The tragedy came suddenly, in a blur of medical panic and loss. She left behind a newborn daughter, Evelyn, too small to understand the finality of her mother's absence. As the years passed, Evelyn grew into a quiet, watchful child, one who often sat in silence, staring at the window like she was waiting for something. At age 4, she began to speak of strange memories. Not dreams, memories. She described the room she was born in, the chaos of nurses yelling, the sharp light overhead. Her father dismissed it as a child's imagination, but her details were uncannily accurate. Then she began asking questions she shouldn't know to ask. Where was the white shawl Rose always wore during winter? Why had her favorite locket been left in the drawer? These weren't guesses, these were observations, from someone who had been there and had come back. As Evelyn learned to speak fluently, her comments grew more specific. She recalled the layout of the old apartment they'd moved out of shortly after her birth, right down to the chip in the bathroom tile. One day, she asked her father why he never wore the gray sweater Rose had knitted for him, the one with the loose thread on the left cuff. No one had ever mentioned that sweater to Evelyn. It had been tucked away in a sealed box, unopened since Rose's funeral. Her grandmother, skeptical and grieving, gave Evelyn a test. She asked who was in a photo album that had never been shown to the child. Evelyn named each person, even mentioning a childhood nickname her grandmother hadn't heard in decades. When she flipped to a photo of Rose as a young woman, Evelyn whispered that it was her. She didn't say it with curiosity. She said it like a fact. What truly unsettled the family was Evelyn's emotional sensitivity. She comforted her father in ways that mirrored Rose's old gestures, placing her small hand on his shoulder just as Rose used to, humming a melody that had never been played in the house since her death. When asked where she had learned the tune, she said she remembered it from before. As she grew older, the memories didn't fade. Instead, they became more structured. She began recalling arguments Rose had with her mother, the scent of the garden in late spring, and the hidden box under the floorboard where Rose once kept letters from her childhood. The box was real, and inside it were the letters, never mentioned, never found until Evelyn led them straight to it. There was no plausible explanation for how she knew. No one had spoken of that box for years. It was as if Evelyn was finishing a sentence Rose had started but never had the chance to complete. Psychologists were brought in. Theories were proposed: cryptomnesia, childhood confabulation, subconscious cues. But each theory crumbled under the weight of Evelyn's knowledge. She knew too much. She remembered feelings that only Rose had ever expressed in private letters. She described moments Rose had never shared with anyone except her husband. The clincher came when Evelyn told him about the final thought Rose had before losing consciousness during childbirth. It wasn't something spoken aloud. It was a silent, desperate hope that her baby would survive. Her husband had been haunted by that unspoken fear for years, and now the child who had lived bore the echo of the one who had died. The idea that Evelyn was Rose, in some way reborn, was no longer dismissed. It began to feel less like superstition and more like the only answer that made sense in the face of the impossible. Evelyn didn't cling to these memories. She didn't dwell on them. Instead, they sat with her like background music, always there, but no longer in control. By her teenage years, she began to separate her identity from Rose's. Yet something about the connection remained. She retained Rose's mannerisms, her empathy, her unspoken bond with the family. Some nights, she would still stand by the window, looking out at the moon, as if expecting a memory to return on the breeze. Her family never forgot what they'd witnessed. They didn't need to believe in reincarnation to feel the truth of it. The woman they had lost had somehow not entirely left. Through Evelyn, something had continued. A flicker of a soul, perhaps, or the persistence of love refusing to fade. Not everyone gets a second chance to say goodbye. But in this house, goodbye was never the end. The case of Evelyn and Rose remains one of the quietest yet most profound reincarnation stories ever told.
No hipnosis, no media frenzy.
Just a child who remembered a life cut short and a family forced to reframe what they believed about death. There was no dramatic twist, no supernatural proof, only the steady accumulation of impossible facts and quiet truths. For those who knew them both, there was no question. Rose's life hadn't ended in the delivery room. It had simply paused. And through Evelyn, it resumed. Subtle, mysterious, and undeniably real. This was not about religion or belief. It was about continuity, about how sometimes life bends its own rules to mend the deepest wounds. And in doing so, it reveals that the soul may be more resilient and more persistent than we ever imagined. Chapter 18: The Time Loop of Revolution. In the outskirts of Santiago de Cuba, a quiet boy named Tomas grew up with fire in his dreams. At first, his parents dismissed the nightmares as childhood fears. Faceless men, smoke, gunfire echoing across jungle hills. But as Tomas aged, the dreams sharpened. He began sketching crude maps of guerrilla routes no one had taught him. He drew 1950s-era weapons with eerie accuracy, labeling them with names he should never have heard. When asked how he knew, he simply said he remembered. Tomas spoke of a life in the forest, of ambushes and betrayal, of dying beneath a gray sky with the sound of marching boots. It wasn't just imagination. His details were precise. A name surfaced in his ramblings: Mateo Alvarez, a revolutionary fighter executed in 1957 for defying the Batista regime. The strange part, that name was carved into a faded monument just a few miles from Tomas's home. And the last name? Alvarez, his family name again. Curiosity turned to unease when a visiting cousin brought old photos from their grandfather's collection. Tomas pointed to a grainy image of a group of young rebels and without hesitation identified Mateo Alvarez. Not as someone he'd seen before, as someone he had been. He named other men in the photo, including one who had betrayed the group to government forces. The betrayal, confirmed decades later through declassified records, had never been public knowledge. Tomas described the man's nervous habits, his last-minute desertion, even the code word used in the failed mission. All of it accurate, none of it teachable. His grandfather, who had fought in the same region, turned pale when Tomas repeated a phrase, one known only to his fallen comrades. That was when whispers began to circulate. Was the boy a reincarnation of a forgotten martyr? Or had family trauma etched itself into his blood in a way science had yet to explain? As Tomas entered adolescence, he became haunted by one particular recurring dream. Standing blindfolded, hands tied, as a rifle barrel pressed into his back. He always woke up before the shot, gasping for breath. Medical tests found nothing wrong. Psychological evaluations found no trauma, no abuse, no historical reading habits to account for his knowledge. He had no interest in school history lessons, often correcting his teachers when they got revolutionary details wrong. When taken to the very field where Mateo Alvarez had been executed, Tomas froze. He walked to a bare patch of earth and said this is where it happened. The spot matched records. Unmarked, forgotten, but Tomas knew, not as a tourist, as someone who had walked there before. The moment rattled his parents. They began documenting everything: drawings, speech patterns, dreams, even his instinctive knowledge of guerrilla survival tactics. One historian privately called it the most disturbing case of historical memory he'd ever encountered. The final thread came in the form of a hidden diary. During home renovations, Tomas's family found an old wooden box in the attic, sealed and stuffed behind cracked boards. Inside was a notebook, faded ink, revolutionary rhetoric. It belonged to Mateo Alvarez. No one in the family had known it existed. Tomas opened it like it was an old friend, flipping to the last entry and quietly reading it aloud. He recited the final line before even seeing it, his voice steady. That was when belief shifted from curiosity to certainty. The writing matched stories Tomas had already told. The final words described a failed escape, a friend's betrayal, and a strange feeling of unfinished duty. Tomas never asked to see the diary again. He said he remembered everything he needed, that he had already lived it once. What disturbed the family most was his solemn tone. There was no performance, no dramatics, just quiet remembrance, like a man who had come home. Even stranger, Tomas's personality began to shift. He became more serious, more idealistic, more committed to justice. He led student protests at his high school, calling out corruption and inequality. He quoted revolutionary ideology he had never studied, often before the class reached the subject. His voice carried a kind of conviction beyond his years. Teachers described him as intense, as if he was fighting an invisible war most couldn't see. When asked about it, Tomas said he felt a duty that wasn't his but had become his again. A second chance to finish what had been cut short. Though he couldn't explain why, he believed his past death hadn't ended his cause. It had only pressed pause. And now, in a different body, in a new world, that mission was back in motion. This wasn't just a child remembering history. This was a revolutionary soul caught in a loop, alive again but still at war. The story of Tomas Alvarez never made headlines. There were no documentaries or book deals, just quiet acknowledgement from those who witnessed it. For them, it was a haunting reminder that the past isn't always buried. Sometimes it loops, and sometimes it bleeds through the cracks of time and flesh. The revolution Mateo Alvarez had once died for had evolved, reshaped by decades of struggle. But in Tomas, its spark endured. This case, unlike many others, didn't speak of a life remembered for curiosity's sake. It was remembered with urgency, as if the soul couldn't rest until its fire had finished burning. Reincarnation, in this case, wasn't comfort. It was unfinished business, a mission carried across lifetimes. And as Tomas continued his quiet crusade for justice, his dreams no longer ended at the gunshot. They moved past it, into something new, something reborn, a revolution that refused to die, even when its soldier did. Chapter 19. Science Meets the Soul. For years, reincarnation lived in the shadows, an idea dismissed by scientists, ridiculed by skeptics, and confined to philosophy and religion. But in small research labs, university offices, and locked filing cabinets around the world, a quiet rebellion was building. It began with patterns. Children too young to read speak of lives not their own. They recall names, places, deaths many later verified. In the halls of the University of Virginia, one man changed everything. Dr. Ian Stevenson spent decades investigating these claims, compiling thousands of case studies from children across continents. He didn't try to prove a soul's existence. He simply documented the impossible. Birthmarks matching bullet wounds. Children naming relatives from families they'd never met. While the mainstream medical community turned away, others followed his lead. And what they found was chilling in its consistency. These weren't anecdotes. They were cases repeatable, testable, structured. A new frontier was taking shape where psychology met the paranormal, and science dared to look beyond death. At Yale, another group began building databases of spontaneous past life memories. Researchers tracked children as young as 2 who described events from eras and regions they couldn't have possibly encountered. They checked historical records, maps, even obscure dialects. And more often than not, the stories held up. A boy in Sri Lanka who knew where a murdered man's body was hidden. A girl in Turkey who corrected a priest on ancient funeral rites. These cases weren't random. They clustered around trauma, violence, and sudden death. Some scientists began theorizing that memories might imprint on consciousness like scars on flesh. The theory, trauma echoes. It doesn't always die with the body. These institutions weren't selling reincarnation. They were listening to children, analyzing patterns, and allowing data to guide the conversation. The results were unsettling. If so many of these children described past lives with such accuracy, could memory exist without brain tissue? Was the soul a kind of storage system beyond biology? One of the most compelling aspects of this research was its global reach. In cultures where reincarnation is widely accepted, children's claims were more readily explored. But even in the West, where the idea is taboo, researchers found strikingly similar patterns. The differences weren't in the memories themselves, but in how adults responded. In India or Thailand, parents recorded every word their children said. In America, they dismissed them as imagination, until the children led them to places they had never visited and named people they had never met. In a study across 5 continents, researchers found that 70% of children who reported past life memories did so before age 5. Many forgot those memories as they grew older, unless they were nurtured. That forgetfulness became part of the mystery. Why did these memories surface so early? And why did they fade? Was there a biological mechanism for remembering past lives? Or were we just tuning in to something our brains usually suppress? Perhaps the most controversial element came from controlled experiments. Some children underwent hypnotic regression, a technique designed to recover subconscious memories. In rare cases, under hypnosis, they spoke languages they had never heard. One child in the U.S. began speaking fluent Gaelic, an ancient dialect no longer taught. Another sketched architectural blueprints from 17th century Venice with flawless proportions. Critics argued these were artifacts of suggestion, implanted by leading questions. But in many cases, the children had never been exposed to such ideas before the sessions. Independent verification teams were brought in. The results didn't offer proof in the traditional sense. They offered evidence, startling, repeatable, and hard to dismiss. One medical journal quietly published a paper titled Beyond Biology, The Cognitive Imprint of Unseen Lives. It caused a stir, then vanished beneath more conventional studies. But the spark had been lit. The world of science was no longer unanimously dismissing reincarnation. It was whispering about it in the back rooms of credibility. The resistance, of course, remained strong. Mainstream neuroscience still claimed memory is rooted in neural pathways, chemicals, and synapses. Without a brain, there can be no memory. Yet the children in these cases had no access to the lives they described. No books, no documentaries, no familial ties. Even under scrutiny, the data refused to fold. Some researchers proposed quantum theories of consciousness, suggesting that memory might exist outside the brain, tied to energy or fields we cannot yet measure. Others revisited ancient beliefs through the lens of modern science, pondering whether life and death were less linear than we thought. The conversation grew louder. At conferences once filled with scoffing academics, open-minded scientists began asking quiet questions. What if reincarnation was not mysticism, but a misunderstood function of reality? What if the laws we rely on are incomplete, and the evidence we ignore is the very proof we seek? Doubt was no longer safe. It was starting to crack. In the final years of his life, Dr. Stevenson reportedly said he never set out to prove reincarnation, only to study what people claimed and determine if it deserved further attention. He left behind more than 2,500 documented cases, each one a story that defied logic but clung to truth. Today, younger researchers carry that torch. They study brainwaves in meditating monks, investigate consciousness after cardiac arrest, and continue collecting the stories of children who remember too much. These aren't isolated oddities anymore. They're part of a growing body of evidence that challenges our most basic assumptions about identity, memory, and death itself. Science, for all its precision, is beginning to flirt with the metaphysical, not because it wants to, but because it must. The cases refuse to go away. The stories repeat, the patterns deepen, and perhaps most importantly, the children keep remembering. The soul, once a matter of belief, is quietly becoming a subject of inquiry, and the results are impossible to ignore. Chapter 20: The Emperor's Last Breath. In a quiet neighborhood in Osaka, a 4-year-old boy startled his family when he began insisting he used to wear a crown. Not a toy crown, he clarified, but the imperial chrysanthemum crest. He demanded to be called by a title none in his household had taught him. His speech was strangely formal, and he bowed to elders in ways forgotten by modern etiquette. His parents assumed it was mimicry, perhaps from television or books. But then he began drawing symbols, imperial seals, and classified insignias no longer publicly used. He described war meetings in rooms that had been sealed since the end of World War II. When his father took him to the Kyoto Imperial Palace, the boy whispered about secret doors and ceremonial paths never mentioned in public tours. Guides dismissed it as coincidence, until one retired curator quietly admitted the boy's directions matched old architectural plans lost after the war. Something about him unsettled even the most composed observers. By the time he was 6, the boy began having vivid dreams. He would wake up in the night muttering names: admirals, ministers, and generals, all of whom served under Emperor Hirohito. He described internal conflicts during the war, political betrayals, and rituals from the imperial court that had never been publicly documented. He even recounted a ceremonial chant used only once during a private wartime surrender ritual. One historian, skeptical but intrigued, arranged a meeting under the guise of an educational interview. The boy was given photographs of unknown court chambers, and he immediately named their function and placement. When asked about a sealed document known only to imperial archivists, he described its contents in disturbing detail. The historian later confirmed those details matched a classified surrender plan drafted but never executed. This child, born decades after the war, knew secrets that had never left the palace walls. And most chilling of all, he spoke of regret, of decisions he never wanted to make. As he aged, the memories became more specific. He recounted early life experiences of being groomed for leadership, tutored in ethics, and bound by divine heritage. He described riding in carriages through Tokyo, sitting in war briefings, and later, standing in front of microphones to renounce his divinity. He said the shame never left him, that he bore the burden of every life lost in the name of the empire. The boy never spoke of war as glory. It haunted him. Researchers interviewed him under controlled conditions. When shown rare film reels of the imperial family, he identified distant cousins by nickname. When given objects from the 1940s, he picked out the one that had once belonged to the emperor himself, a ceremonial brush used to sign treaties. His pulse quickened at the touch. The researchers hesitated to publish. If this were true, they weren't just documenting another case of reincarnation. They were unraveling the tightly wound fabric of Japan's historical narrative. The Japanese government did not take interest publicly, but private inquiries were made. One official visited the boy's home under the guise of a cultural heritage officer. What he heard reportedly left him pale and silent. The boy knew personal habits of the late emperor, his favorite tea, the way he tapped his fingers when deep in thought, and a phrase he used in solitude that was never caught on record. Weeks later, another envelope arrived at the family's door. Inside was a photograph, an old portrait of Hirohito as a child. On the back, in faded ink, was a note that read, "For the one who may one day return." The parents denied knowing who sent it. The family was relocated soon after, under the pretense of a private scholarship program. The boy disappeared from public view, but whispers continued among academics and archivists who had seen too much to forget. The question lingered: had an emperor truly returned in the body of a child? His case remains the most closely guarded, least documented publicly, and yet most unnerving of all. It sits at the crossroads of religion, national identity, and the metaphysical. If the boy's claims are false, they are so intricately detailed they would require access to information that even historians can't retrieve. If they're true, they force a rethinking of power, legacy, and the very nature of consciousness. Could the soul of a man burdened with empire choose to return, not to rule, but to remember? The story has never been officially verified. No names have been released, but researchers involved in the case confirm the boy's accuracy exceeded all previous reincarnation reports. And now, as he enters adulthood, his memories are fading slowly but steadily. He says he no longer dreams of war, but of gardens, of peace. Perhaps that is the soul's way of healing. But for those who have heard his story, one chilling question remains. What happens when history itself refuses to stay buried? This final case does more than close a chapter. It opens a door. Through 20 stories across the globe, from battlefields to temples, from paintings to sealed palaces, the evidence has whispered the same unsettling message. Death may not be the end. Children speak of lives they never lived. Scars map wounds never received. Dreams carry echoes of languages no longer spoken. The science is uncertain. The skeptics are loud. But the patterns are undeniable. We began this journey with a boy who knew too much, and we end with one who may have ruled an empire. In between, we walked a line between belief and proof, myth and memory. Perhaps the truth lies not in one case, but in the tapestry they weave together. A tapestry that hints over and over that the soul may survive the flesh, that lives may echo across time, and that in rare, mysterious moments, the past returns not in books, but in breath.